On a chilly Saturday morning last June, in a high school parking lot in Lakewood, Washington, dozens of volunteers gathered to hand out packages of food.
They said, we have this food drive coming up. We provide, it was like 10 pounds of chicken, a bag of fruits and vegetables, bathroom stuff, kitchen stuff, and we just need to get the word out. And I was like, oh, I was speechless. I'm like, are you serious? That is amazing to me. Like, yes, I will help you get the word out.
This is Ray Holberg. She also volunteered during the event.
I helped prep everything and bag everything up and then helped pass it out the next day to all of the military families. And then at the end of the thing, I went through and I picked up my own bag of food that they provided. And yeah, it was amazing.
Ray's husband is in the Navy. She has 4 kids and she volunteers for several organizations that support military families, including one called the Military Family Advisory Network. Is it MFAN? Is that how I say it?
MFAN, yeah, exactly.
Shannon Razadin is the organization's president.
We've been doing these large-scale food distribution events in the locations where we saw the highest frequency of food insecurity. So Fort Hood, Fort Bragg, Joint Base Lewis McChord up in Washington and the Norfolk, Virginia area. And at those events, we serve between 600 and 800 households in a day.
Food insecurity is when a person either doesn't get enough nutritious food or is worried that they won't. And despite the hundreds of billions of dollars the U.S. spends on defense each year, it's a big problem in the military.
We often see it come down to between housing and food. And so it looks like families having to choose what bills they're going to pay in a certain month and what can you hide more easily. You can't hide if you're not paying your rent or your mortgage. That's going to catch up. But you can hide if you're not eating or if you're eating food that is less nutritional for your family.
1 in 6 active duty military families experienced food insecurity in 2021, according to MFAN. That's more than the general population, which the USDA puts at 1 in 10. Shannon says that recent supply chain issues and inflation, they've just made the problem worse. But even before the pandemic, military families were hurting.
So as an organization, we've really been focused on this issue for several years, but for the longest time, we were getting feedback that, oh, it's not a problem, oh, it's money mismanagement. But we knew there was more to it than that.
I'm Lacey Healy, and on this episode of Things That Go Boom, food insecurity in the force. Ray takes us through 17 years of financial ups and downs for her family. And we ask the experts, how, with an almost $1 trillion a year military budget, did we get here?
What is actually going on with the economy nowadays? The price of gas? Inflation? Are we in a recession? I'm Jeff Guo, co-host of NPR's Planet Money. Come along with our super team of econ experts as we delve into the stories that show you how the world really works. That's Planet Money from NPR.
I am 40 years old. I live in Jacksonville, Florida. I have a 13, 12, 9, and 7-year-old.
Ray and her family just moved down to Florida from the Pacific Northwest.
We're right on the beach. It's actually pretty amazing. It's tropical. We just came off of 7 years of sea duty. So we've done at least 5 deployments in the last 7 years. So it's been nice to have him home for more than, a couple weeks at a time.
Ray started volunteering with MFAN a couple of years ago. But back in 2007, she was working at a prison in Washington state. She met her husband playing co-ed softball.
I had a good job. He was in the military. He was at E3, E4, making decent money.
E3, E4, those are military pay grades. And by decent, we're talking ballpark $40,000 a year with food, housing, and maybe some additional hazard pay included. When Ray and her husband got married in 2007, they were both working, and they didn't have many bills. So it worked. That is, until they had their first child in 2009.
Then it's like, oh no, now we need daycare and more gas and more food. What do we do? And so we talked about it. We went back and forth with it. And it was a hard decision because I didn't want to give up my career, but I knew he couldn't give up his career because that's just not possible in the military. So we decided we would make it work, and I stopped working.
Suddenly, Ray found herself managing a single-income household with 1 child and a husband overseas. And right away, food became a concern, especially when they discovered that their baby needed special formula.
He had bad eczema and like digestive system issues. So his formula for just a small can was like $30 a pop. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess this is showing me how expensive food's gonna be for this growing boy that I just had. Well, then I had our second child in 2010, so throw that into the mix. Thankfully, I could use regular formula for the second guy, so it wasn't as bad, but there's now 2 mouths to feed. We then get transferred over to Illinois, and we're there for 3 years, and so he's not at sea.
In 2011, their pay dropped. Her husband was stateside now, so no more allowance for family separation and no more sea pay.
I would say the biggest struggle for us was between 11 and like 14, because that's when we were on shore duty. So he was always home. So that, I know that sounds really bad, but with him being home, that's another mouth to feed,
You had to
right?
feed him.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
you
I'm
had
like,
to feed a
okay,
dude.
Yes.
Yes.
And so, because like when he's on the ship, he gets 3 meals a day.
Ray and her husband also had 2 more kids during this time, making them a family of 6.
For those 3 years, I was like, babe, like, okay, this is what we're going to eat. And I know that they're little kids, but they need the nutritious stuff too. I'm not just going to feed them processed things.
Ray had already become a master coupon clipper, meal planner, and budget keeper, but it wasn't enough.
I tried doing some sales on the side from home, and it worked for a while, but then it was too hard. Childcare is the number one thing. Yes, because there's many spouses that want to go out and work, but we don't know what our military spouse's schedule is like. Sometimes they come home at 1, sometimes they come home at 6 o'clock, sometimes they don't come home at all. And you're like, okay, well, how do I tell my employer that? You know what I mean? So it's like, what do I do?
Because military families have to move so often, they usually don't have a network of support like parents or siblings close by to help with the kids. And wait lists to access military childcare can stretch for years. As a result, many spouses are unemployed or underemployed in way higher numbers than the general population. A survey conducted by Blue Star Families in 2020 found that they're actually 7 times more likely to be unemployed than their civilian peers. And it's hard to care for a family on a single income, which Shannon from MFAN sees as a national security issue.
When you think about it, it's a force readiness issue, it's a national security issue, and it comes down to the future of the all-volunteer force. So we know that the future of the all-volunteer force lies in military kids, and we know that there is ties between food insecurity and things like obesity.
Only about 1% of the U.S. population serves in the military, and the vast majority of new recruits report having a family member who served. The U.S. military has actually become something of a family business, even as military families struggle to put food on the table.
Well, okay, if someone is dealing with obesity, they might not even be eligible to serve later on.
But it's not just about recruitment. Shannon also thinks that trouble at home could lead to trouble overseas.
So say someone's deployed overseas and they're in a mission-critical job, and they know that their family back home isn't sure if they're going to have enough food to feed everyone at home during the week. Is that service member going to be able to fully focus on their mission if they're worried about their family back home being able to put food on the table?
When times were hardest for Ray and her family, they were really hard. So to help, they got on WIC, a national program designed to help young children and some pregnant and postpartum people get adequate nutrition.
So they look at all of your income coming in to see how much you make. So like if you have 4 people or less, there's a certain dollar sign that you have to make less than.
The max income to qualify for WIC today would be just under $70,000 a year for a family Ray's size. Folks who are eligible receive what are basically vouchers for specific nutritious foods, things like milk, bread, or eggs that can be redeemed in grocery stores. But for lots of families, this extra help comes with added stress.
When I first started, they came on like paper checks, and it had everything written out on it that you were able to get that they would provide for you. And it was only specific items. Like if I needed the cheese and the eggs, but they didn't have the bread, I would lose out on that bread. When I was using the checks, I was like, oh my God, like, okay, like, is this gonna work? Did I get the right brand? Is the machine gonna go off and be like, hey, this lady's using the wrong item for WIC. Like, watch out.
Right.
Nobody likes to ask for help. My husband's out at sea, and I'm like, this is a great time. I'm sweating. Like, oh my gosh, what is happening?
Still, Ray says that WIC was an important part of keeping her family running. That is, when she was able to access it.
WIC is an amazing thing to use. If you can utilize it, I highly recommend it. Don't feel ashamed for going in and trying to sign up for it. It could be discouraging because you have to take in a pay stub. And they sit there and they put numbers into the calculator right in front of you. And you're like, oh, did we make it this paycheck? Sometimes maybe you get a raise or something and they do it and then they look at you and they're like, oh, I'm so sorry. You're over by like $3. We can't issue you these checks. And you're like, wait a minute, you just gave them to me last month. Ugh. It was just a little bonus that my husband got. There's nothing that we can do. And they're like, nope, sorry, it's in our system.
And that horrible sinking feeling of thinking that you qualify for help and then being turned down. According to Shannon over at MFAN, this happens to military families a lot.
And one thing that a lot of people don't necessarily recognize is that military families in most cases are ineligible for some of the safety nets that are out there.
These problems hide in the shadows. It's hard to admit that you're giving up almost everything in your life to serve, only to struggle with such basic needs. Then, when some families do look for help, many can get lost in the bureaucracy, in federal penny pinching. You can see this if you look at SNAP, the federal program formerly called food stamps. Right now, when a service member applies for SNAP, the housing allowance that they get from the military is considered income. And in most cases, this makes military families ineligible for assistance. But that's not the way it works for civilians.
When they receive Section 8 housing, those benefits are not counted against them when it comes to calculating for SNAP, whereas in the military, a somewhat analogous housing allowance is.
Sarah Strader is the executive director of the Secure Families Initiative and a military spouse. And she told us that's one reason why there's a policy proposal out there right now that would change this rule.
This would put military service members on par with other civilian Americans' eligibility for something like SNAP.
Which, let's be real, is kind of an uncomfortable fix, making it easier for military families to go on food stamps. But for now, it could help some families like Ray's weather unexpected expenses.
Our truck broke down. We were driving down the road and one of the tires just blew out. And so it was like, oh, okay. And they were big tires. Like, it wasn't like I could just go and get a small random tire from the tire shop. And it was about $600 just for one tire that I needed to match the other 3 on the truck. And I'm like, oh, okay. And we ended up having to put it on a card. Thankfully, we had one to put it on because neither of us like having credit cards. But thankfully, we got one. And we put the tire on a credit card and we had to figure out how to pay it off.
When families are living so close to the wire, any issue can push them into a position where they can't be confident that they'll be able to buy food. And that's a big deal. Research ties food insecurity to all kinds of health issues, like depression and chronic illness. And yet the problem persists. We know that kids that don't get enough to eat face many of the same physical and psychological harms measured in adults, plus developmental issues. Ray's kids never went hungry, but she says that until a couple of years ago, she was spending only about $400 a month on food for the whole family.
And that was including the proteins and the vegetables and the carbohydrates and all of that. So I was able to make certain meals and spread them out, for the kids to get their nutritional meals and stuff like that.
Spread them out? Do you mean like eat less often?
No, and that's the thing. That's what most families do, or some families do. I'm not that person, and they're little, and I want them to have their treats. I want them to have some of those fun things, but I also need it to be nutritious. What I mean is, we eat a lot of rice. I've got an Asian background. That's what I grew up on, and so I made a lot of meals with rice and maybe like one piece of chicken that I can like shred up and spread out. to make people get, a little bit of everything, as opposed to everybody getting their own piece of chicken. I did a lot of vegetables, stuff like that. And thankfully they ate it without complaining.
Ray often has to find creative solutions to make her family's life work, whether that's turning a mandatory cross-country move into a road trip or finding a flexible job so that she can still get her kids to school each day. And the realities of military life mean that she's not alone. Here's Shannon again.
When you think about the frequent moves, you think about the separation, and that military service is always really the top priority. And so military spouse employment has been a huge problem. When you're moving every 2.5 years, you have this constant stop and restart, and then just not living near a network of support. I have a story that I love to tell. We had just moved to Newport, Rhode Island, my husband's active duty, and it was the first day of school, and I knew no one there. And I was trying to figure out who I could list as the emergency contact for my kids. And I'm literally in the drop-off line, and I say to the woman behind me, like, "You look really nice. Can I list you as my daughter's emergency contact?" And she's great, and we're really close friends now. But that's just the reality, right, for military families.
These realities of military life mean that many families struggle to put food on the table. And this is especially true for enlisted folks with kids. But why is it like this for the people who are supposed to be putting their lives and their loved ones on the line to support the rest of us? That's after the break. Okay, so because we were working on this episode, I have been bringing up military family food insecurity to just about everyone I meet lately. And most of the time, people are really confused. I mean, we pay a ton of taxes to support the military, and a decent chunk of that budget goes toward personnel. So how is this still a problem? Shannon hears that question all the time.
Every time we talk about it, there's this overarching, oh my gosh, how could that be? And I don't think that's anyone's fault. I think it's just that if you're living this life, you understand it more.
Shannon says that this lack of understanding extends to military leaders as well.
For the longest time, the issue of food insecurity was not one that was recognized publicly within the Department of Defense. And so they used to use SNAP usage as how they would determine what food insecurity looked like. But we know that that's a flawed way of looking at it because families aren't eligible for SNAP.
Another issue is that families don't like to talk about it.
Unfortunately, there's this culture of shame. And there's this concern, too, that, if I'm having a hard time financially, how could this impact the service member's security clearance? And kind of some of these second and third order effects that military families have to be aware of, right? And there is this culture of resilience that is really entrenched in the military community, which can make it very difficult for people to ask for help when they need it. But we are seeing our lines at our food distribution events get longer and not shorter, which tells us two things. One, the need is very much still there, but also that it's getting a little bit easier for people to ask for help.
The military has tried to address food insecurity before. In 2002, Congress instituted a program called the Family Supplemental Subsistence Allowance, which was supposed to be a substitute for food stamps. Again, turning to a supplemental benefit. But according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the program was underutilized and eventually discontinued because it also counted the basic allowance for housing as income, which made most families ineligible. But what made it worse was that service members had to access it through their base chain of command. Talking to your boss about money trouble can be embarrassing, to say the least. But it could also potentially harm a service member's career. And Ray says that means a lot of military leadership just don't even realize the problem exists.
So in the beginning, a couple of the guys were like, we've never heard of any of our guys struggling. And I'm like, do you really think they're going to tell you? Do you really think someone's going to walk up to you and be like, "Sir, I don't have food on the table for the next 2 weeks"? Because they know what's your response going to be. "Oh, I'm so sorry, you didn't budget your paycheck correctly." And he just kind of looked at me. And he said, "I never thought of it that way." And I was like, "But you don't. With all due respect, sir, you are a high-ranking officer. You don't have to think about where your next meal is going to come from. Your paycheck is like triple the amount that even my husband makes as an E8. And then there's other ones that are like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for letting us know. I know some people that could totally use this. I will get them on the list today. That is amazing. Yes, thank you so much.
I spend a lot of time working with paratrooper pay issues. I was working on it again today.
Nils Olson is a company commander in the Army. He spoke to us in his personal capacity, not as a representative of the Army or the U.S. government. And he's based in Italy, which means the problems that he sees are a little different than what families in the U.S. might experience. The one thing they have in common is that it's tough to have a family in the military.
I have a junior enlisted guy who's got 4 kids. And that's where it becomes kind of hard. So we had to kind of coach him up on, hey, how can we be a little bit more effective with when you use the car so you can consume less gas? But I think it still's a little tight. It's a little bit harder when you got 4 mouths to feed on a specialist salary.
In some cases, it's even tougher to have a family when you're stationed abroad. Nils knows this firsthand. See, he just got married. But his wife has to spend half of the year in the U.S. for work. And that's partially because of something called a Status of Forces Agreement that was inked in 1951.
The intent was that American spouses coming over to live with service members wouldn't take jobs from the local nationals.
I'd imagine that makes the prospect of having children while stationed there very hard.
Oh, impossible. Yeah. It also, I'll be honest with you, it has reared its head in some very interesting ways, such as you're not allowed to work at all. So even if it was, I'm going to babysit people's kids or cut your hair, or this was an incident, I promise you this is real. A lady was making breakfast burritos and selling them to the soldiers on base and was told, hey, you're not allowed to do that. You're making the facilities that exist here legitimately, like less, you're taking away their business.
Wow.
So that was a no-go. And grounds to get sent back to the States. So again, unique to the bases that are, in a different country, but nonetheless.
And 70-year-old rules about who's allowed to work are not the only thing that could use a refresh. Military pay overall is still shaped by some old assumptions. Here's Sarah from the Secure Families Initiative again.
The way that our military has structured salary and compensation is outdated. It does not reflect the heterogeneous force of our military. It reflects a more homogenous, junior enlisted, no dependents type family structure that used to be more common, but it isn't as universal anymore.
So if we want fuller pantries, your next question might obviously be, can't we just pay soldiers more?
I think having competitive pay raises for service members is an important component.
But almost everyone we spoke to told us that is also not the only solution.
Compensation policy is often a blunt instrument, and what they really need is a scalpel to identify the service members and their families who need it most.
That's Dr. Brandon Archuleta. He's a fellow at the Center for a New American Security and studies the history of military compensation and the all-volunteer force. He's also a strategist for the Army and spoke to us only in his personal capacity. He told us that one way to help those most in need, usually those in the junior ranks, may be a new allowance that's already in the works.
The Pentagon just announced that in 2023, they'll be instituting a basic needs allowance for service members who have dependents who are earning about 130% of the federal poverty guideline. And so in practice, what that means is that a service member with a family of 4 at home earning about $3,000 or less living in the continental United States would be eligible for this basic needs allowance.
This sort of solution is a policy decision. It forces the Pentagon to take out its almost $1 trillion checkbook and think about people like Ray, and whether buying the latest, greatest weapon is worth her eating processed food over fresh produce. But policy can be messy and slow, which means it's also possible that this new allowance will continue to treat housing pay in a way that makes the vast majority of struggling families ineligible for help.
And so I think the Pentagon ought to test this and keep a close eye on who's receiving the benefits of this basic need allowance. And then over time, with a longitudinal study, we can see as the economy recovers and we move past this inflationary period, we can get a better sense of how these service members and families level out. and whether a basic needs allowance is still necessary.
Brandon says that in political science terms, military families are, quote, an advantaged target population.
In other words, there's lots of money to support service members and their families and veterans, and there's very little political conflict or disagreement about whether to spend that money.
He's right. Military pay raises are a major talking point every year in budget negotiations. It's one reason that the National Defense Authorization Act is one of the only pieces of legislation to pass without fail every year. Even so, families are going hungry.
The FY23 NDAA represents a bipartisan effort to support our active duty personnel with a 4.6% pay raise and invest in the critical capabilities that our armed forces need to defend our nation and our interests abroad.
It also takes care of our servicemen and their families.
Providing the authorities and resources our warfighters need to defend our nation is the greatest responsibility we have in Congress.
It cannot simultaneously be the case that we are spending billions of dollars on our military, yet families can't even afford to put food on the table. That therefore necessarily means that high Pentagon spending does not automatically mean we're supporting the troops.
New ideas for how to address this problem are being introduced and passed all the time. And some of them are a big deal. Things like the Spouse Hiring Act, which would provide tax incentives for hiring military spouses, along with changes in rules for how often families have to move and expanded resources for childcare. And so here at Things That Go Boom, we started to wonder, how's it going? And are these solutions going to be enough?
Is it enough to address the problem? Two answers for you. One, we don't know, because food insecurity has been an under-researched problem for so long. There's been so much shame and stigma around it as a topic that not enough effort has put into gathering the data I think we would need in order to say with 100% certainty that this suite of policy proposals would in fact equate to a 100% solved problem. And my second answer is no, of course not, because anytime we talk about solving the challenges facing military families through the lens of downstream Band-Aid policy solutions without taking into account the foreign policy operational tempo that has been required of our military families for the last 20 years, that has no slowing down in sight. If we ignore that ecosystem, we are ignoring a huge exacerbating factor that has and will continue to make life harder for military families. So we cannot divorce this conversation from broader decisions over war and peace.
And passing the kind of real reforms that military families need, the stuff that goes beyond supplemental assistance and cost of living increases, that's always been harder. You mentioned a lot of incremental things that are being considered, things to help spouses move their jobs and pursue jobs. But are there any big policy changes that are on the table that would really get at this?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. I think too often what policymakers realize is that there are no silver bullets, and that these are multifaceted problems that need complex and multifaceted solutions. And that's especially the case in personnel matters. There are 1.2 million active duty service members in uniform around the world, and that's not including the nearly 800,000 National Guard and Reserve who are also part of the total force. And there's just no easy answer. And so the Pentagon has to take a holistic, multifaceted approach to address this problem. I wish there were a silver bullet, but there really isn't.
This is not sexy work. Studying how our defense priorities are in turn hurting the people who defend us. But if I've learned anything working in D.C., it's that all of its biggest buildings, the Pentagon, the Capitol, even the Smithsonian, run on priorities. Right about now, the folks in Congress are deciding how much money should go to the military. And they've already authorized almost $46 billion on top of the president's request. That's more than 4 times what it might cost to give every active duty service member a $700 a month raise. As for Ray, her husband is set to retire in a few years. And they're thinking of moving. One more time.
We're hoping to go back to the West Coast. My kids, they talk about it and they want to go back. They miss the hiking because we are really outdoorsy people. We just love being outside in nature. And it's hot over here. There's bugs and alligators and all kind of things. And so it's kind of hard to do.
Things That Go Boom is distributed by Inkstick Media and PRX. This episode was produced by Nikki Galteland and me, and edited by Christina Stella, Katie Toth, and Sahar Khan. As always, Darian Schulman writes the music for our show, and Robin Wise makes each episode shine like a brand new F-35. Thank you to MFan for their help with this episode. And thanks to the supporters and foundations that make our work possible, as always. The Carnegie Corporation of New York and Ploughshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Colomb Foundation, Craig Newmark Foundation, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. And of course, thank you to all of you. If you're listening and you like what we do, seriously, stop right now, leave us a review. I promise we won't dog you anymore. And come visit us anytime on social at Inkstick Media. The holidays are coming, but we'll be back in just 2 weeks with a little blast from the past. And then in January, we'll officially be back with a look at what one suitcase full of corn can tell us about the U.S. and China. Happy holidays. We'll be back soon.
Thankfully, I had a can of Spam in the pantry.
Spam always coming to the rescue.
My grandma always told me, she said, every time you go to the grocery store, at least buy 1 can of Spam and make sure you have rice. And that's at least something that you have to eat. Yes.
Yeah, actually, that's kind of true.